quite a few guys that were into this type of thing. You told me a story about Ken Caminiti, a Major League Baseball player who was an MVP. Tell us that story about this.
The longer Kenny got into his career, he started utilizing steroids. He wanted an edge, but that was part of the culture of baseball back then.
He destroyed himself. That phrase right there is not clickbait. It is not a dramatic exaggeration designed to grab your attention. It is the honest and painful truth about one of the most gifted baseball players of his entire generation. Ken Caminiti was a warrior. He was a champion. He was the kind of player fans paid to watch and teammates felt lucky to stand beside. But behind the MVP trophy and the standing ovations and the sold-out stadiums, something dark and relentless was building. The steroid era did not just bend the rules of Major League Baseball, it broke real human beings. So why would a true warrior ever pick up a needle? And why did so many others follow? I am Mason, and this is Baseball Icon. If this story hits you the way it hits me every time I go back through it, go ahead and use the hype feature right now and give this video some hype so more baseball fans get to see what really happened inside those clubhouses during one of the most troubled eras the sport has ever known. Now let us get into it. To understand what Ken Caminiti confessed and why it shook the entire foundation of professional baseball, you first have to understand the man himself. He was not a fraud from the beginning. He was not a cynical cheater who looked for shortcuts on day one. He was a genuinely exceptional athlete who came up through the game the hard way and loved every brutal inch of it. He was born on April 21st, 1963, in Hanford, California. He grew up swinging from both sides of the plate, developing one of the most powerful and accurate arms ever seen, playing third base in the big leagues. He played with fire. He played with fury. He was the kind of player who made his teammates feel protected just by being in the dugout next to them. But here is how we are going to tell this story today. Because this is not just the story of one man. The steroid era was built on many voices, many perspectives, many lives shaped by the same broken system. So before we get to the center of this story, we're going to work our way through the players who saw it all from the outside in. We're going to count them down from number 5 all the way to number 1. Each voice adds a layer. Each perspective reveals something the one before could not. By the time we get to number 1, you will understand not just what happened to Ken Caminiti, but what happened to the entire sport. Number 5 is Mark Grace. He is the perfect starting point for this countdown because his story is about quiet suffering, the kind of suffering that does not make headlines. The kind that just accumulates season after season in the background while everyone else is celebrating numbers that were never real. Grace was one of the purest hitters of his era without any question. During the entire decade of the 1990s, no player in all of Major League Baseball had more total hits than Mark Grace. He led the league in doubles as well across that same decade. He was precise. He was consistent. He was a craftsman at the plate who understood the strike zone better than almost anyone in the sport. He spent 16 full seasons in the big leagues and did it the right way, from beginning to end, without ever touching performance-enhancing drugs. But here is the painful part. Mark Grace played first base, and first base in that era was expected to be a power position. Fans expected home runs. Teams built their lineups with that assumption baked in. When you play first base in the steroid era and finish your entire career with 173 home runs across 16 seasons, people start drawing comparisons to the guys at your same position who hit 40 or 50 home runs in a single year. What most fans sitting in the stands did not understand was that many of those other players had a chemical advantage that Mark Grace refused to ever take. He spoke openly about the pressure. He was not naive. He understood exactly what was happening in clubhouses all across the league. He could see the physical changes happening to other players season after season. He could hear the conversations in the locker room. He knew what the shortcuts looked like, and he knew exactly what they cost. While other players used anabolic drugs to pile on muscle mass quickly and turn routine warning track fly balls into home runs that crowds went wild for, Grace chose something different. He chose to protect his long-term physical health above everything else. He was blunt and even darkly funny about it. He said flat out that synthetic hormones would tear you up as far as your manhood is concerned. That one line tells you everything about where his head was at. He knew the risk. He calculated it carefully, and he said no. He watched his modest power numbers get compared unfavorably to players whose bodies were being chemically rebuilt season after season. He watched inflated competitors receive bigger contracts, bigger headlines, and bigger reputations that were constructed entirely on chemistry rather than craft. He finished his career without the home run totals the era demanded of his position, and the record books simply do not reflect what he actually sacrificed to keep his integrity intact. Mark Grace stayed clean and paid the price every single year in silence. The numbers fans cheered in that era were not just impressive statistics. They were a weapon used against clean players like Mark Grace every single season he stepped onto the field. Number 4 is Mike Sweeney. If Mark Grace represents the quiet pain of a pure contact hitter trapped by expectations, Mike Sweeney represents something even more personal. He represents the clean player on a struggling team who watched the unfairness build and compound around him year after year with no relief in sight. Sweeney was a Kansas City Royals all-star. He was genuinely talented. He worked hard and cared deeply about the game, but he played through chronic back and injury issues for much of his career, which already made every season harder than it needed to be. And he did all of it without ever reaching for a chemical boost. What Sweeney saw in that era was devastating in a very specific way. He understood that when a large portion of the league is using performance-enhancing drugs and none of them face any real consequences, the sport does not just lose its integrity on paper, it loses something more immediate. It becomes a game with two completely different sets of rules operating at the same time in the same stadiums. One set for the players who are willing to inject and risk their bodies, and a completely different set for the players unwilling to compromise their health and their values. For someone like Sweeney, already fighting physical issues every season, that imbalance was not an abstract ethical complaint. It was a daily professional reality that affected his career in measurable and deeply frustrating ways. He pointed to testing as the only genuine solution, not motivational speeches in the clubhouse, not integrity clauses buried in collective bargaining agreements, not handshake promises between players who already knew what was happening. Actual, random testing that showed up unannounced and carried real consequences for anyone who failed. Because without that kind of accountability, clean players had absolutely no protection. They could not prove what they were dealing with. They just had to absorb the losses. They had to swallow the contract shortfalls and the award snubs and the daily frustration of knowing they were competing honestly inside a competition that had stopped being honest long before they ever arrived. Sweeney put the crisis in plain terms. An unlevel playing field does not just take wins away from clean players. It takes entire careers. And nobody with the power to fix it was moving fast enough. Number 3 is Frank Thomas, the man they called the Big Hurt. Frank Thomas was one of the most dominant pure hitters in baseball history, a massive presence with extraordinary bat speed and the patience at the plate that made pitchers genuinely afraid. He did not need drugs. He never wanted them. And he said so loudly, which was not a popular thing to do in an era where silence was the unspoken rule of the clubhouse. Was pushing for strict drug testing as early as 1995, 7 full years before Ken Caminiti sat in that Texas garage and told the truth. Frank Thomas was already standing up in front of his peers and saying loudly that something was very wrong with what was happening in the sport. He was not universally celebrated for it. Clean players who speak up in environments where secrets are being kept tend to face cold shoulders from people who have something to hide. But Thomas kept pushing because he could see in real time exactly what was happening to his own legacy and to the history of the game he loved. The moment that cut him deepest was the year 2000 American League Most Valuable Player Award. That award went to Jason Giambi. Years later, Giambi admitted to using serious performance-enhancing drugs during that period. Thomas had played the entire season cleanly, produced elite numbers through honest work, and still lost the most important individual award in the American League to someone with a pharmaceutical edge he never had and never wanted. That is not a minor frustration you shake off by springtime. That is a structural theft. Real money in the contracts that followed MVP awards. Real history. A permanent spot in the record books that belongs to a different name. Thomas also watched peers post historically impossible power numbers season after season, while he continued to produce outstanding results the right way and received far less attention for it. He saw clean work buried under fake numbers year after year, and he refused to stay quiet about any of it. When Senator George Mitchell launched his comprehensive investigation into steroid use in Major League Baseball, Frank Thomas was the only active player who sat down and spoke openly with the investigators. Every other active player looked away. Thomas stood alone again and told the truth. He was elected to the Hall of Fame on the first ballot, and that honor carried extra weight because everyone who voted knew exactly what kind of environment he had navigated to earn those numbers with clean hands. Number 2 is Curt Schilling. If Frank Thomas was the clean voice pushing for accountability from inside the game, Curt Schilling was the one who pulled the curtain all the way back on what the view from inside the clubhouse actually looked like during the peak years of the steroid era. Schilling did not confess to using steroids. He provided something different and, in some ways, even more powerful. He backed Caminiti's central claim directly and without hesitation. He confirmed that at least half the league was actively using performance-enhancing drugs. And then he went further, saying the other half had seriously considered doing it. That is not a story about a few bad actors. That is a culture, a sport that stopped protecting its own integrity and let chemistry become the accepted new normal. But it is the physical detail Schilling provided that made his account truly unforgettable and impossible to dismiss. He described changes so dramatic, so consistent, and so visible that teammates encountered them every single day without any way to pretend they were not there. He talked about glistening and watery skin that was a direct consequence of human growth hormone use. He talked about players getting braces on their teeth, not for cosmetic reasons, but to correct facial structures that were physically shifting and changing shape under sustained chemical pressure. He talked about brows pushing forward and changing the overall appearance of faces he had known for years. And he talked about heads growing so dramatically in overall size that batting helmets stopped fitting the way they always had. Helmets that had been ordered to a specific size and had fit just fine the previous season suddenly would not close properly because the skull beneath them had physically changed. These are not cosmetic side effects that a reasonable person overlooks on a busy game day. These are visible, undeniable, and medically significant signs of bodies under extreme and prolonged chemical stress. And these warning signs were present and visible every single day to coaches, to athletic trainers, to team physicians, to managers, and to front office personnel who walked through those clubhouses on a regular basis. Nobody with the authority to act did anything meaningful about what they were seeing. The evidence was standing right there in plain view, changing incrementally in real time, and the official response from the people with the power to stop it was continued silence and deliberate inaction. If you were a clean player in that environment, you were not just at a competitive disadvantage on the scoreboard. You were a member of a shrinking and increasingly isolated minority, watching the sport you had devoted your entire life to transform into something you barely recognized, with no institutional support and no meaningful protection from the people who were supposed to be running it honestly. And that brings us to number 1, the man at the center of everything, Ken Caminiti. On May 29, 2002, Ken Caminiti sat down with investigative journalist Tom Verducci in a Texas garage. That conversation produced the Sports Illustrated cover story known as Totally Juiced. And in that story, Caminiti admitted something that no high-profile superstar had ever been willing to admit before him. He confessed that his legendary 1996 National League MVP season had been built entirely on anabolic steroids, drugs he obtained from Mexican pharmacies and used to push his body far beyond what natural recovery could have delivered. He then estimated that approximately half of all major league players were actively using performance-enhancing drugs at some point during the grinding 162-game season. Just like that, a silence that had protected the sport for years was broken wide open. Before that article hit newsstands, Major League Baseball existed in a state of willful institutional blindness that served almost everyone with power and hurt almost everyone without it. Players were free to chemically alter their bodies with virtually zero oversight from the league or the union. There were no real testing protocols in place, no meaningful consequences for getting caught, because there was no honest system designed to catch anyone. The sport had essentially looked the other way and allowed itself to become a pharmaceutical competition, where the sophistication of your drug regimen carried more weight than the depth of your natural talent or the years of your honest work. Caminiti was the first major star to put his own face and his own name on that truth, publicly, clearly, and without flinching. He named himself. He named no one else. And that distinction matters far more than people sometimes give it credit for. He was not trying to bring anyone down. He was not calculating a media strategy. He sounded like a man who had been carrying something far too heavy for far too long, and finally set it down, not because it was convenient, but because he could not carry it for one more day. To fully understand why he made the choice he made, you have to look at what that 1996 season was actually costing him physically before it ever became the MVP campaign fans remember. The list of injuries was staggering by any standard. A torn rotator cuff in his non-throwing shoulder, a biceps tendon tear, an abdominal strain pulling at him constantly, ongoing and relentless pain in his back, his elbow, his groin, and his hamstring. He was carrying injuries that would have ended most professional seasons without debate and justified most players sitting down without a second thought. Instead, he was leading the San Diego Padres toward a division title and playing through it all without showing any of it on his face. In May of that year, when the shoulder situation reached a crisis point and he genuinely could not meet the physical demands of the position through natural recovery alone, he turned to anabolic steroids. He made a decision he understood was a shortcut and a risk, and possibly a mistake even in the moment he made it. But he made it because the alternative, in his mind, was letting down the team and the city and the game that had defined his entire life. There was one game during that season that captured who Ken Caminiti was as a baseball player more clearly than any statistic ever could. On August 18, 1996, the Padres were playing the New York Mets in Monterrey, Mexico. Caminiti was severely dehydrated before the game even started. He was suffering from intense cramping and diarrhea. He received liters of intravenous fluids in the locker room before he went out. He ate a Snickers bar, and then he walked out onto the field and hit 2 home runs to secure the win for his team. That game became known simply as the Snickers game. It became baseball folklore. It became the story teammates told over and over again to explain exactly who Ken Caminiti was at his absolute core. His teammate Trevor Hoffman understood that absolute refusal to quit better than almost anyone on that roster. Hoffman was a Hall of Fame closer who had navigated his own serious surgeries and pitched through chronic arm pain without ever once using it as a public excuse or a reason to step back from the work. He had lived the warrior experience himself and understood what it actually cost. He saw in Caminiti the same warrior spirit at its most extreme and most absolute. Hoffman noted that a simple, quiet nod from Caminiti in the clubhouse carried more genuine weight than a long motivational speech from anyone else on the entire roster. That quiet intensity was the core of Caminiti's leadership and the source of the trust his teammates placed in him every single day. His teammates did not just respect him in the way professionals respect a skilled colleague. They borrowed strength from his presence. They played harder because he was out there beside them. They believed they could win situations they had no business winning simply because Ken Caminiti was in the lineup. That is what makes the steroid chapter of this story so genuinely and deeply tragic. The exact qualities that made Ken Caminiti beloved by every player who shared a clubhouse with him were the same qualities that helped lead him toward destruction. His warrior mentality, his absolute inability to accept sitting down when the team needed him to perform, his need to be there for the people counting on him above every other consideration, including his own physical survival. All of it pushed him toward a decision that saved his 1996 season in the short term and helped break the rest of his life over the long run. The steroids repaired his shoulder enough to finish the year competing at the highest level. He won the National League MVP unanimously, but the synthetic testosterone that rebuilt his body also permanently disrupted his endocrine system. His natural hormone production shut down. His body became chemically dependent on outside substances. That physical dependency landed directly on top of deep personal pain he had been carrying since middle school. When he suffered abuse, he spent his entire adult life trying to numb with drugs and alcohol. The steroids did not create the addiction that eventually took his life, but they fed it and accelerated it in ways that no award and no amount of fan love could ever reverse. Now let us look at the full scale of what Caminiti described. He said about half the league was using, and the voices that followed confirmed it from every direction. Chad Curtis put his estimate between 40 and 50%, and he added something that made the numbers even more disturbing. He said steroid use was discussed openly in clubhouses across the league, not in code words, not in careful whispers behind closed doors. Openly. Players talked about their drug regimens the same casual way they discussed swing adjustments and scouting reports. Because there were no testing rules in place, no consequences waiting on the other side of the conversation, players felt completely free to be transparent about it because the institution that was supposed to police them had made a quiet decision not to look. Rickey Henderson captured the isolation of clean players in one unforgettable line. When asked about Caminiti's 50% estimate, Henderson said, if the number is 50%, it has to be 49%, because he was not one of them. Behind the humor is something real and genuinely painful. One of the greatest players in the entire history of baseball was using a joke to explain that he had become a member of a shrinking minority inside his own sport. Clean players were not just outnumbered. They were operating in a world that had quietly rewritten the rules around them while they were busy competing honestly. When cheating becomes the accepted normal, a sport stops being a sport in any meaningful sense. It becomes a race to see who can push their body furthest while avoiding detection. And the players who refuse to participate do not get rewarded for their integrity. They get bypassed. They get paid less. They get quietly removed from record books that should carry their names for generations. The steroid era stole real outcomes from real people, real money in contracts, real awards that changed careers, real historical achievements that belong to different names. And it did all of this, not in secret, but in plain sight, season after season, while the league office and the players' union argued about privacy and collective bargaining, and everything except the actual human cost sitting right in front of them. Now, let us talk about how the silence cracked all the way through. Caminiti was the first break in the wall, but not the last. Jose Canseco took a very different and much louder approach to exposing what he knew. Where Caminiti had named only himself and spoken from a place of personal exhaustion and accountability, Canseco released a book called Juiced in 2005 and named everyone he could think of. He claimed he had personally injected some of his high-profile teammates with steroids. He called himself the godfather of steroids and presented the entire story as a matter of pride rather than regret. The baseball establishment tried hard to dismiss the book as self-serving fantasy from a bitter player looking for one final moment of relevance. But then, the facts started catching up with the story in ways the league could not spin away. Rafael Palmeiro stood before members of Congress and looked them directly in the eye and denied, under oath, ever using performance-enhancing drugs. And then, shortly afterward, he tested positive for a banned substance. Mark McGwire, one of the biggest and most celebrated home run heroes the sport had ever produced, eventually made a full public confession in 2010, admitting to steroid use during his record-breaking seasons. Canseco, despite all his self-promotion and commercial motivations, had been telling the truth about the substance of what he described. Together, despite everything that separated their methods and their motivations, Caminiti and Canseco accomplished something that neither could have managed alone. They broke the wall of silence that had protected baseball's broken infrastructure for over a decade. Caminiti lit the match, and the fire spread in every direction. Once the fire was burning hot enough to see from outside the sport, the league could no longer sustain its posture of looking away. For years, the Major League Baseball Players Association had successfully argued that drug testing constituted an unconstitutional invasion of player privacy. That argument had kept baseball far behind the anti-doping standards maintained by the Olympic movement and by other major professional sports leagues. But once Caminiti put a human face on the epidemic, once the public could see clearly that this was not an abstract policy debate among lawyers and executives, but a real human crisis playing out across the sport every single season, the privacy argument fell apart under the weight of sustained public and media and eventually political pressure. Just 50 days after the publication of Totally Juiced, the players agreed to the first random drug testing program in the entire history of Major League Baseball. 50 days after one honest confession from one tired man in a Texas garage, years of institutional resistance crumbled. That timeline tells you more about the scale of the failure than any policy document ever could. The league had the power to act much sooner. The union had the power to lead on this long before they were forced to. Neither moved until they had absolutely no remaining choice. That first testing program created the foundation for the historic congressional hearings in 2005, where players were called to Washington and required to answer questions under oath they had spent years refusing to engage with in any other setting. Those hearings put the crisis on national television in a way that no clubhouse whisper or sports page story ever had. And the sustained pressure from those hearings eventually produced Senator George Mitchell's comprehensive independent investigation. The Mitchell Report, released in December of 2007, documented how drug use had compromised the integrity of the sport for more than a decade, and laid out in careful and uncomfortable detail exactly how the culture had been allowed to grow unchecked for so long. Frank Thomas was the only active player who spoke openly and on the record with Mitchell's investigators. Every other active player found a reason to look away or protect the culture or protect themselves. Thomas stood alone again, told the truth once more, and let the record reflect exactly who he was. The reforms that followed were real, and they were necessary. Testing became genuinely rigorous. Consequences became meaningful and public. The infrastructure of a clean sport that players like Thomas had been demanding since 1995 finally began to take real and lasting shape. It was too late to undo the damage already done to the record books and to the careers of clean players who had lost too much during the peak years of the era. But it was not too late to build something better for the generations of players who came after. And yet, the Hall of Fame debate continues to this day as the most visible and most painful reminder of everything that era left behind. Clean superstars like Frank Thomas and Rickey Henderson were elected on their first ballots without significant controversy. Their greatness was easy to celebrate because their methods were beyond any reasonable question. But players like Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens, who produced numbers that belong statistically among the greatest performances in baseball history, remain excluded from Cooperstown because of their documented or heavily suspected ties to performance-enhancing drugs. Other players from that era face ongoing exclusion based on suspicion and circumstantial evidence, even without confirmed positive tests on record. The annual ballot debate has become its own kind of ongoing punishment for an era the sport still does not know quite how to fully classify or forgive after all these years. That unresolved argument is part of the true legacy of what happened. It is not just the tainted records or the lost awards. It is the permanent uncertainty that hangs over an entire generation of baseball history and everyone who lived through it, clean or otherwise. The sport did not just lose a set of rules during those years. It lost something much harder to rebuild. It lost the basic trust that made the numbers on the field mean something beyond themselves. Ken Caminiti died on October 10, 2004, in the Bronx, New York. He was 41 years old. The cause of death was an overdose involving cocaine and opiates. He died just 2 years after sitting in that Texas garage and choosing honesty over the silence that might have been easier. He was gone before the congressional hearings took place, gone before the Mitchell Report was released, gone before the reforms that his confession helped push into existence became real and enforceable policy. He did not live to see a single piece of the change that his honesty helped create. He gave the sport a gift he never got to see unwrapped. We should not remember Ken Caminiti only as a cautionary tale or a negative headline from a complicated era. He was a real human being with a life that extended in every direction beyond the baseball diamond. He was a father of 3 daughters. He was a man who built business partnerships and personal friendships that had nothing to do with the game. He was a teammate who inspired the kind of genuine devotion that only comes from real respect, not from statistics or awards. He was a man who had carried real pain since childhood and tried to outrun it his entire adult life through the intensity of his work and the ferocity of his loyalty to the people around him. He was a man who made a devastating choice inside a system that made devastating choices look like the only rational path available. And he was a man who eventually told the truth about all of it, when telling the truth was the hardest and most costly thing he could have possibly done. The steroid era did not find weak people and destroy them. It found driven, talented, deeply competitive people and placed them under enormous institutional pressure inside a system with no guardrails, no consequences, and no honest reckoning for years on end. The players who fell were not uniquely flawed or morally inferior to anyone sitting in the stands watching them. Many of them, like Caminiti, were among the most intensely dedicated and genuinely tough people in the entire sport. But even the most dedicated person will eventually bend under enough sustained pressure when the institution that is supposed to protect fair competition has quietly decided to stop doing its job. The lesson is not complicated. Great play is worth celebrating. A great sport is worth loving. But great play built on broken bodies and broken lives and stolen records and a corrupted institution is not worth any price we could put on it. Fans deserve to cheer for real. Players deserve to compete on even ground, and the sport deserves to be exactly that. A sport, not a chemistry competition where the most enhanced body wins the most games and nobody in power says a single word about it. The reforms pushed through in the years following Caminiti's confession made baseball a meaningfully cleaner sport. Not perfect, never perfect, but cleaner in ways that matter deeply, and in ways that are directly connected to what one tired man chose to say out loud from a folding chair in a Texas garage. The warriors of the clean era, Frank Thomas and Mark Grace and Mike Sweeney and Ricky Henderson, all the players who refused to compromise when compromise was the easier path, deserve recognition that goes beyond what the statistics capture. They played the game honestly when honesty cost them real money and real opportunities and real pieces of their legacy. Their names may not top the home run leaderboards from that era. They may not hold the records that made the front pages and the highlight reels, but they held something more important. They held their integrity intact through one of the most corrupted periods any professional sport has ever experienced. And that will always matter more than any single season statistic ever could. Ken Caminiti was one of those people, in his own broken and complicated way. He destroyed himself. That is true. But he also told the truth when telling it cost him everything. And that truth helped save the sport he loved more than anything else in his life. Remember him as more than a headline. Remember him as a man who was flawed and broken and honest all at once. If this story moved you, drop a comment and tell me which voice hit you the hardest. Was it Grace watching his craft get undervalued year after year? Was it Thomas losing an MVP to a player who was secretly enhanced? Was it Caminiti himself finally setting the weight down? Let me know below. And if you have not subscribed yet, hit that button now so you never miss another story on Baseball Icons.